Hello, and welcome to Lyla's Lullabies, where we spend time exploring with Lyla, a traveler who wanders the world at her own pace, while sharing her most enriching and restorative moments with you. In tonight's story, we'll follow Lyla as she explores the enchanting city of Madrid, Spain. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to remember. Just settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself go. We're so glad you're here. Whenever you're ready, let's begin. The late afternoon sun hung golden over Madrid, casting long shadows across the plaza as Lyla emerged from the Opera metro station. The air held that particular warmth of summer in the city, dry and enveloping, carrying with it the faint scent of sun-heated stone and something sweet, perhaps churros from a nearby cafe. She paused at the top of the steps, letting the daylight wash over her face after the cool dimness below. Around her, the city hummed with its familiar rhythm. A street musician had set up near the metro entrance, his guitar case open on the cobblestones, and the first notes of a Spanish ballad drifted through the early evening air. Lyla stood for a moment, adjusting the light scarf she'd tied around her shoulders more out of habit than necessity. The melody was lovely, unhurried, and she found herself swaying slightly before fishing a few coins from her bag and dropping them into the case with a smile. The musician nodded his thanks without breaking his rhythm, and Lyla turned toward the western edge of the old quarter, where the streets would lead her eventually to the Parque del Oeste. She had no particular schedule this evening, no one waiting, nowhere she needed to be. It was a gift she'd learned to appreciate more in recent years, these pockets of unstructured time, when she could simply wander and let the city reveal itself to her at its own pace. She'd been in Madrid once before, years ago, on a trip that felt now like it belonged to a different version of herself. Younger then, more rushed, trying to see everything and take the perfect photographs, moving from landmark to landmark with the kind of determined energy that left little room for actually feeling a place. This time was different. This time she'd given herself permission to simply be here, to notice the small things, to linger. The streets around the opera house were a mixture of grandeur and everyday life. Elegant buildings with wrought iron balconies stood beside corner shops and small bars with tables spilling onto the sidewalks. Through open windows, Lyla could hear the sounds of domestic life, someone practicing piano, the clatter of dishes, a television announcer's voice rising and falling. She loved this about European cities, the way private life and public space wove together, how you were never quite alone even when walking by yourself. She passed a small grocery store where crates of fruit sat outside, the peaches looking particularly ripe and golden in the slanting light. The shopkeeper, an older man in a white apron, was arranging tomatoes with careful precision, and Lyla caught his eye and smiled. He returned it with a nod, and she felt that small spark of connection that comes from simply being noticed, acknowledged, even in silence. The street began to slope gently upward, and Lyla adjusted her pace, in no hurry. Her sandals made a soft clicking sound against the pavement, and she noticed how the light was changing now, taking on that particular quality of early evening when everything seems to glow from within. The white and cream facades of the buildings turned buttery, almost honeyed, and the shadows deepened to a soft purple blue. At a corner, she paused to consult the small map she'd picked up from her hotel, though she hardly needed it. The Temple of Debod was roughly west and north from here, sitting at the edge of a park that overlooked the city. She'd been meaning to visit it since she arrived 3 days ago, but had let herself be distracted by other things: a museum she stumbled upon, a cafe with particularly good cortado, an afternoon spent simply sitting in the Plaza Mayor watching people come and go. But this evening felt right for it. There was something about the angle of the sun, the warmth without being too hot, the way the city seemed to exhale after the intensity of midday. She folded the map and tucked it away, then continued up the hill, following the subtle pull of instinct and the occasional street sign pointing toward Parque del Oeste. The neighborhood shifted gradually as she walked. The buildings became a bit more residential, the streets quieter. Balconies overflowed with geraniums and trailing vines, and she passed an elderly woman watering her plants, the stream from the small watering can catching the light like liquid gold. The woman hummed to herself, entirely absorbed in her task, and Lyla felt a pang of something, not quite envy, but a kind of tender recognition of those small, repeated acts that make up a life. She thought about her own routines, the ones she'd left behind for this trip and the ones she might return to, the morning coffee in her favorite mug, the walk she sometimes took before work, when the day was still fresh and full of possibility, the way she'd started, in recent months, to pay more attention to these small rituals, to invest them with a kind of intentionality she'd once dismissed as unnecessary. There was comfort in them, she'd discovered, a kind of anchor. The street opened suddenly onto a wider avenue, and the view expanded. Ahead and to her left, she could see trees, the dark green of pines rising against the pale sky, and beyond them, just visible, what looked like the edge of a park. The traffic here was busier, but not overwhelming, and she waited at a crossing for the light to change, watching a young couple pass by, their arms linked, heads bent together in conversation that made them oblivious to everything else. Lyla had been that way once, she thought, so consumed by the person walking beside her that the whole world could have been on fire, and she might not have noticed. It hadn't lasted, that particular relationship, though it had felt at the time like it would last forever. That was the trick of it, wasn't it? The intensity that made you certain, and then the gradual realization that certainty and reality were not always the same thing. But she didn't feel sad thinking about it now, just aware. Aware of how she'd changed, of how those experiences had shaped her into someone who could now walk through a foreign city alone and feel not lonely, but peacefully solitary, content in her own company. That was its own kind of gift, hard-won perhaps, but valuable. The light changed, and she crossed. Moving toward the park entrance, she could now see clearly ahead. The air smelled different here, fresher, with the green scent of trees and grass mixing with the urban smells of exhaust and pavement. A jogger passed her, moving with that steady rhythmic determination of someone deep in their own zone, and Lyla stepped to the side to give them room. The entrance to Parque del Oeste was marked by an opening in the stone wall that ran along the avenue, and as she passed through it, the noise of traffic seemed to recede, absorbed somehow by the trees and open space. The path ahead was wide and packed earth, bordered by neat rows of pines and the occasional bench. A few people were scattered about, someone reading on a bench, a small child toddling after a ball while a parent watched nearby, a woman with a tiny dog on a jeweled leash. Lyla chose a path that seemed to lead upward and westward, following the signs that indicated the Temple of Debod was this way. The park was lovely, she thought, well maintained, but not overly manicured, with that pleasant sense of being a refuge without being too removed from the city that surrounded it. Through the gaps in the trees, she could catch glimpses of buildings, but here, under the canopy of pines, with the dappled light falling across the path, it was easy to imagine herself somewhere more remote. She passed a fountain where water trickled lazily from a stone spout, and she paused to trail her fingers through it, enjoying the coolness against her skin. A couple sat nearby on a bench, sharing a bag of sunflower seeds, and speaking in quiet Spanish, their words rising and falling in a rhythm that sounded almost musical, even though Lyla couldn't understand most of what they were saying. The path curved, and suddenly the trees opened up, and there it was, the Temple of Debod, sitting on a slight rise, its ancient stone glowing warm in the evening light. Lyla stopped walking, simply taking it in. She'd known it was here, had read about it, seen pictures, but there was something startling about the reality of it. An actual Egyptian temple, thousands of years old, reconstructed here in the middle of Madrid. Removed from its original home to save it from flooding, given as a gift, transported stone by stone across continents and centuries. She walked closer, her steps slowing even more now, not wanting to rush this. The temple sat in a shallow reflecting pool, and the water was so still it created a near-perfect mirror image. The columns and stone blocks doubled, hovering between sky and earth. A few other visitors were scattered around, some taking photographs, others simply sitting on the low walls that bordered the pool, but there was a sense of quiet respect, as if the space itself asked for a certain reverence. Lyla found a spot on the stone wall where she could sit and look at the temple from an angle, where the light hit it just so. She settled herself carefully, crossing her ankles and letting her bag rest beside her. The stone was warm beneath her, still holding the heat of the day, and she leaned back slightly, supporting herself with her hands, and just looked. There was something deeply moving about it, she thought. This structure that had stood beside the Nile, that had witnessed so many cycles of flood and harvest, so many human lives coming and going, and now here it was, in a park in Madrid, still standing, still beautiful, still serving as a place where people came to pause and reflect. It made her think about continuity, about how things endure, how they're sometimes saved and preserved and given new contexts, but remain essentially themselves. She thought about her own life, the things she'd carried with her, the ways she'd been reconstructed, not dramatically perhaps, but in small significant ways. The ending of relationships, the changing of jobs, the moves from one place to another, the loss of people she'd loved, and through it all, some essential core of herself that remained, that adapted, that found new ways to stand solid even when everything around her shifted. It was a hopeful thought, she realized, not in a naive way, but in a quiet, persistent way. The kind of hope that doesn't expect perfection or permanence, but trusts in the possibility of continuity, of carrying forward the things that matter. A breeze picked up, just a whisper of movement in the still air, and it carried with it the scent of pine and faintly, jasmine from somewhere she couldn't see. The light was changing again, deepening, the golden hour giving way to something softer, more rose-tinted. The sky above the temple was beginning to show streaks of pink and pale orange, though sunset was still some time away. Lyla watched as a woman approached the temple's entrance, moving slowly, her head tilted back to look up at the hieroglyphs carved into the stone. Even from this distance, Lyla could see the sense of wonder on her face, that particular expression people get when they're confronting something that connects them to a much larger story than their own. She remembered feeling that way herself at different points in her life. Standing in cathedrals, walking along ancient walls, touching stones that had been touched by countless hands across countless years. She felt it now, actually, that sense of being part of something continuous and vast. Not in a way that made her feel small, though there was that too, but in a way that made her feel held, somehow, connected. As if all the people who had ever paused to appreciate this temple, whether in Egypt or here in Spain, were linked in an invisible chain of attention and appreciation. A group of teenagers walked past, laughing about something, and their energy broke the spell slightly, but not unpleasantly. Lyla smiled, listening to them switch between Spanish and what sounded like English, their voices bright, with that particular intensity of young friendship. They climbed onto the wall on the opposite side of the pool, taking selfies with the temple behind them, and she thought how everyone brought their own way of experiencing a place, their own needs and rituals. She shifted on the wall, stretching her legs out in front of her and rotating her ankles. She'd done a lot of walking today, this morning through the Retiro Park, where she'd watched people rowing boats on the lake. At midday, through the narrow streets of the Barrio de las Letras, where she'd stopped for lunch at a tiny place that served the most incredible tortilla española she'd ever tasted. Her feet were tired but not painfully so, just pleasantly worn in the way that came from a day well used. The sun continued its descent, and the light on the temple shifted moment by moment, a slow transformation that was mesmerizing in its subtlety. Lyla found herself breathing in time with it, slow and deep, letting the peace of the place settle into her bones. She thought about nothing in particular and everything at once, the way your mind does when you're relaxed and present, thoughts arising and dissipating, like ripples on the reflecting pool. She thought about what she might do tomorrow, perhaps visit the Prado, which she'd been saving for when she felt ready to really take in art without rushing. Or maybe she'd return here, to this park, in the morning, when the light would be completely different and the city would have a different rhythm. Or perhaps she'd do something she hadn't even imagined yet, something she'd discover by accident, by allowing herself to remain open to possibility. That was another thing she'd learned, the value of leaving space in a plan, of not filling every moment so tightly that there was no room for surprise or spontaneity. She'd been someone who planned meticulously once, who needed to know exactly what was happening and when. And while there was still comfort in structure, she'd found that some of the best moments came in the gaps, in the unscheduled hours when she simply followed her curiosity or her mood. A man with a camera on a tripod set up near the water's edge, and Lyla watched him work, adjusting angles, checking his settings, waiting for the light to be exactly right. She appreciated that patience, that dedication to capturing a moment. She'd brought a camera herself, a small digital one that fit in her bag, but she hadn't taken it out yet this evening. Sometimes it felt more important to just look, to imprint the image on memory rather than on a memory card. Though perhaps she would take one photo, just one, before she left. Something to help her remember not just how the temple looked, but how she'd felt sitting here, in this moment of gentle contentment. But not yet, not quite yet. She stayed on the wall as the light continued to soften, and the sky began its gradual display of color. More people came and went, but the park never felt crowded, and there was something lovely about that, about sharing this space with strangers who were all here for more or less the same reason, to find a bit of beauty and peace at the end of the day. Lyla thought about the people in her life back home, wondered what they were doing right now. It would be earlier there, midday perhaps, depending on which home and which people she was thinking of. Her sister would probably be at work. Her friend Rachel would be picking her kids up from summer camp. Her mother would be in her garden, most likely, pulling weeds or deadheading roses, that meditative work that she'd always said kept her sane. She'd call them later, Lyla thought, or send a message, let them know she was thinking of them, share a photo maybe, of the temple or the park. But for now, this time was hers, unshared, and there was something precious about that too. The way travel could create a temporary separation from your regular life, a space where you could be entirely yourself, without the roles and responsibilities that normally defined you. Not that she wanted to escape those things permanently. She missed aspects of home, missed her routines and her people. But this intermission, this pause, felt necessary. Restorative in a way that went deeper than just physical rest. It was a chance to remember who she was outside of all those contexts, to reconnect with the parts of herself that sometimes got overshadowed by daily demands. The breeze picked up again, stronger now, and it carried the cooler promise of evening. Lyla rubbed her arms absently, though she wasn't really cold. The scarf would be enough, if she needed it. She loved this time of day, this in-between time, when the day hadn't quite released its hold but night was already waiting in the wings. Liminal. That was the word. A threshold between one thing and another. She thought about thresholds, about transitions, about how much of life was actually spent in these in-between spaces, moving from one phase to another, one place to another, one version of yourself to another. It could be unsettling, that sense of being between states, not quite here or there. But it could also be freeing, a chance to shed what no longer served you, to imagine what might come next. A young boy ran past, chasing after a soccer ball that had gotten away from him, and his father jogged after him with an amused expression. They spoke in Spanish, the boy's voice, high and excited, the father's deeper and patient. Lyla watched them until they disappeared down another path, then turned her attention back to the temple. The water in the reflecting pool was still remarkably calm, despite the breeze. The temple's image wavered slightly, but never broke apart entirely, maintaining its ghostly double beneath the real thing. Lyla thought about reflections, about how we see ourselves, sometimes clearly, sometimes distorted, sometimes doubled like this, the image both accurate and inverted, familiar and strange. She'd been doing a lot of reflecting lately, in both senses of the word, looking back at her life, considering choices made and paths taken, and the person she'd become as a result, and also trying to see herself more clearly, more honestly, without the flattering or harsh filters she sometimes unconsciously applied. It was harder than it sounded, that clear seeing, but worthwhile, she thought, even when what you saw wasn't always comfortable. A couple walked past hand in hand, their fingers interlaced, and Lyla felt that small pang again, not envy exactly, but a kind of wistful recognition. She'd had that. She might have it again, or she might not, and that would be okay too. She was learning, slowly, that happiness didn't have to look a certain way, that there were multiple valid paths through a life, and that the one she was on, even with its solitary stretches, was hers, and held its own kind of richness. The sky was definitely shifting now toward evening proper. The pink and orange were deepening, and higher up the blue was beginning to darken toward indigo. Soon the lights would come on around the temple, and it would take on yet another appearance, ancient stone illuminated by modern bulbs, creating a different kind of magic entirely. Lyla had seen photos of it, lit up at night, the temple glowing warm against the dark sky, and she thought she might stay to see it in person. But for now, she was content with this moment, this light. She finally reached into her bag and pulled out her small camera, took a few moments to compose a shot that pleased her, not just the temple itself but the reflection, the sky, the way the light fell across the water. She took 3 photos, checking each one on the small screen, then put the camera away, satisfied. There, preserved. Not just the image, but the feeling, or as close as she could get to it. She stood up then, stretching her back, feeling the pleasant stiffness that came from sitting in one position for a while. Her legs had that faint tingle of reduced circulation, and she walked in a small circle to restore it, smiling at the sensation. Around her, other people were making similar decisions, to stay or to go, to take one more photo or to move on to whatever came next. Lyla decided to walk a bit more through the park before heading back toward the city center. The evening was too beautiful to cut short, and she'd noticed paths leading deeper into the trees, and she was curious where they went. She picked up her bag, settled it over her shoulder, and chose a path that curved away from the temple, following the contour of the hill downward. The light under the trees was dim now, that gentle twilight that softened edges and made everything seem slightly unreal. She could hear the city more clearly here, the distant sound of traffic, a car horn, somewhere music playing. But the park still felt separate, protected somehow, its own small world within the larger one. She passed a man sitting on a bench reading a book, so absorbed he didn't look up as she went by. She passed a woman walking a beautiful golden retriever that looked at Lyla with friendly eyes. She passed a group of teenagers lounging on the grass, their laughter mixing with the evening air, each one a small moment, a brief intersection with another person's day, and then gone. The path opened onto a viewpoint, and Lyla stopped, caught by the sight. From here she could see out over a section of the city, the buildings spreading out below, windows beginning to glow with interior lights as people turned on lamps and prepared their evening meals. The sky above was a gradient now, deep blue at the top fading through purple and pink to a last band of orange gold at the horizon. She leaned against the railing, just looking, thinking how strange and wonderful it was that she was here, in this city, at this moment. That the sequence of choices and chances that had led her here were so specific and yet so random. That tomorrow she'd wake up and walk different streets, see different things, have different thoughts, and all of it would be part of the same journey, the same continuous unfolding of a life being lived. Below her, the city hummed its evening song. Cars moved along streets, people moved along sidewalks, lights came on and went off, conversations happened and ended, meals were cooked and eaten, children were put to bed, lovers came together, friends said good night. The immense, ordinary miracle of daily life, repeated in millions of variations, all of it happening simultaneously, all of it mattering to someone. And she was part of it, Lyla thought, one small thread in that vast tapestry, but a thread nonetheless, connected to all of it in ways she couldn't fully comprehend, but could, in moments like this, almost feel. The web of human life, stretching across time and space, binding strangers together in the simple fact of shared existence. The breeze had picked up properly now, and it carried a hint of coolness that suggested night was coming, even though the day's heat still rose from the pavement and buildings. Lyla pulled her scarf a bit tighter around her shoulders, more for the comfort of the gesture than any real need. She thought about heading back soon, perhaps finding a small restaurant for dinner, nothing fancy, just somewhere local where she could sit and eat and watch the street life go by. She'd seen a place near her hotel that looked promising, with tables outside and handwritten menus propped in the window. Or maybe she'd pick up some bread and cheese and fruit and take it back to her room, eat sitting by the open window, listening to the sounds of the city settling into night. But she'd stay here just a bit longer, she decided, just until the last of the gold faded from the sky, just until the first stars appeared, if they could be seen through the city's ambient light. Just until she felt complete with this day, this evening, this moment. A bird called out from somewhere in the trees, a clear, pure note that seemed to hang in the air for a moment before fading. Lyla took a deep breath, held it, released it slowly. She felt good, tired in the best way, satisfied, at peace. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. New streets to walk, new sights to see, new moments to experience. But for now, there was just this: the darkening sky, the glowing city, the warm air, the sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She stayed at the railing as the light continued to fade, watching the city transform into its nighttime self. The buildings became silhouettes punctuated by windows of light. The streets became rivers of headlights and taillights. The sounds changed, softened, became more intimate somehow. Eventually, when the sky was fully dark except for a faint glow at the horizon, Lyla straightened up. She gave the view one last long look, committing it to memory, then turned and made her way back along the path toward the park entrance. Her steps were unhurried, her mind quiet, her heart full of something she didn't need to name. The city would be there, waiting. Her hotel would be there, waiting. Tomorrow would be there, waiting. But for these last few minutes of her walk back through the park, there was only the soft crunch of gravel under her feet, the whisper of wind in the pines, and the gentle certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. As she walked, the lights of the city twinkled through the trees, and somewhere ahead she could hear the faint sound of that guitar player again, or perhaps a different one, playing a melody that drifted through the summer night like a benediction. Lyla smiled to herself, slowed her pace even more, and let the music guide her gently back toward the life that waited.